Tonight, something extraordinary unfolded behind closed doors, an event that few expected and even fewer were prepared to explain. Long after the cameras were off and the headlines had settled, a shift occurred that may redefine the direction of American politics. Power blocks that once stood unshaken began to fracture, not under public pressure, but under the weight of internal reckoning. For years, unity was projected as strength, loyalty was framed as strategy, dissent was treated as weakness. But political movements are not sustained by fear or silence forever. Eventually, reality asserts itself. Tonight's development signals that a breaking point has been reached, one where calculation has overtaken allegiance. What makes this moment stunning is not disagreement. Disagreement is natural in democracy. What makes it historic is timing. This did not happen during an election loss or after a public scandal alone. It happened quietly, deliberately, when those involved believed the public was not watching. That tells us something critical. Decisions of consequence are often made away from microphones, driven by survival rather than ideology. We are witnessing the collapse of a long-standing internal pact. Lawmakers who once defended the indefensible are now reassessing the cost of continued association, not out of moral awakening alone, but because the political math has changed. Polls shift, donors retreat, voters grow restless, and when the risk becomes greater than the reward, loyalty evaporates. This moment exposes a truth many citizens have long suspected. Political devotion is conditional. When power no longer protects, it abandons. When influence fades, distance is created. And when accountability becomes unavoidable, silence is replaced with statements like, "It's over." But this is not merely about one faction turning on another. This is about a party confronting the consequences of its own decisions. Years of escalation, division, and absolutism have led here, to a crossroads where continuation means collapse, and separation becomes a form of self-preservation. History will not remember this as a single night of betrayal. It will remember it as the moment when denial ended, when private doubts became public signals, when leaders chose damage control over denial, and when the narrative shifted from defense to departure. For the American public, the implications are profound. This is a reminder that institutions correct themselves slowly, painfully, and often too late, but they do correct. Power is never permanent, influence is never guaranteed, and no political figure, no matter how dominant they appear, stands above the collective will forever. Tonight is not the end of a story, it is the end of an illusion, and what comes next will reshape the political landscape in ways we are only beginning to understand. What occurred was not a routine disagreement or a public spectacle staged for cameras. It was a calculated shift that unfolded quietly at a time when public attention was elsewhere and scrutiny was low. Late-night political movements are rarely accidental. They are chosen precisely because they reduce immediate backlash and allow those involved to control the narrative before it fully emerges. This moment followed that exact pattern. While the public slept, lines that had held firm for years began to break, signaling that something far more serious than internal debate was underway. Such hidden shifts reveal how power actually functions. Public unity often masks private doubt, and outward confidence can conceal deep internal concern. For a long time, disagreements were managed internally, dismissed as noise, or delayed for the sake of appearances. But when those disagreements surface collectively and simultaneously, it suggests coordination, not coincidence. This was not one voice speaking out of turn. It was multiple actors recognizing that the existing structure was no longer sustainable. The secrecy of the timing matters. Decisions made in daylight are often designed to persuade voters. Decisions made in darkness are designed to protect decision makers. That distinction is critical. It suggests that those involved were no longer focused on defending a public position, but on insulating themselves from future consequences. When political figures begin to think more about exit strategies than public messaging, it signals that confidence in the current direction has collapsed. This kind of fracture does not happen overnight. It is the result of accumulated pressure, polling data that no longer reassures, donor conversations that turn cautious, private meetings filled with unanswered questions. Eventually, the cost of maintaining silence outweighs the risk of speaking or stepping away. What made this moment stunning was not that doubt existed, but that it finally translated into coordinated action. Historically, major political realignments often begin this way, not with speeches or press conferences, but with quiet decisions made behind closed doors. By the time the public becomes aware, the outcome is often already determined. The late-night nature of this shift suggests that those involved understood its significance and wanted distance from the immediate fallout while positioning themselves for what comes next. For observers, this moment serves as confirmation that stability was already gone long before it appeared to collapse. The public image of unity had become performative, maintained out of habit rather than conviction. Once that realization became widespread internally, the remaining question was not whether change would happen, but when and how discreetly it could begin. In that sense, the late-hour timing is the most revealing detail of all. It tells us this was not an impulsive break, but a controlled detachment, a signal sent quietly but intended to be unmistakable, a recognition that the era being protected no longer had the power to protect those defending it. For a long time, allegiance was treated as an unbreakable contract, a signal of strength meant to deter challengers and reassure supporters. Public loyalty became a currency, exchanged for protection, influence, and political survival. But loyalty in politics is rarely unconditional. It lasts only as long as it serves a purpose, and the moment that purpose erodes, the bond weakens rapidly. What we are witnessing is that precise turning point, where loyalty is no longer viewed as an asset but as a liability. Political actors constantly assess risk, even when they claim to stand on principle alone. Behind every public defense lies a private calculation. Will this association help me win again? Will it protect my donors, my district, my future? When those answers begin to shift from certainty to doubt, behavior changes accordingly. The rhetoric softens, defenses become qualified, silence replaces certainty. Eventually, distance becomes strategy. That transition does not require a public admission, it only requires the recognition that survival is at stake. The collapse of loyalty in this moment is not driven solely by moral disagreement, but by political reality. Polling numbers that once guaranteed safety no longer do. Voters who were once dependable begin to fragment. Financial backers reconsider their exposure. Media narratives harden in ways that cannot be reversed with talking points. In that environment, continuing to stand firm becomes less about courage and more about self-destruction. This shift reveals an uncomfortable truth about power structures. Loyalty is strongest when accountability is weakest. As long as consequences can be avoided, allegiance holds. But when legal, electoral, or institutional consequences become unavoidable, loyalty fractures. Individuals who once framed unity as a virtue begin to redefine independence as wisdom. What was once called betrayal is rebranded as realism. There is also a psychological dimension to this collapse. When political leaders sense that an era is ending, they instinctively seek to position themselves for the next one. Remaining tied to a declining force threatens future credibility. Separation, even if late, offers a chance to claim foresight rather than failure. This is why breaks often happen in clusters rather than isolation. Once one figure moves, others follow, creating the appearance of sudden mass defection when, in reality, doubt had been widespread for some time. The language used in moments like this is revealing. Phrases signaling finality replace those promising endurance. Certainty gives way to resignation. The shift is subtle but unmistakable. The goal is no longer to fight forward but to step aside without being pulled down. Survival replaces dominance as the primary objective. Ultimately, this moment underscores that political loyalty is transactional, not permanent. It is sustained by momentum, protection, and perceived inevitability. When those elements disappear, allegiance dissolves with surprising speed. What remains is not outrage or chaos, but recalculation, a quiet acknowledgement that standing alone is safer than standing together when the ground beneath them is no longer stable. What makes this moment especially revealing is not just what happened, but when it happened. Timing in politics is rarely incidental. Actions taken at unconventional hours signal intention, control, and forethought. This was not a spontaneous outburst driven by emotion or public pressure. It was a carefully chosen moment designed to minimize chaos while maximizing strategic advantage. That alone tells us this was a calculated decision, not an impulsive reaction. When political actors act quickly in public view, they are often responding to crisis. When they act quietly, at a time when attention is low, they are shaping outcomes. The late timing reflects an understanding of how narratives form. By moving before the next news cycle, those involved positioned themselves to influence how the story would be framed, rather than being trapped by it. This is the behavior of individuals thinking several steps ahead, not reacting defensively. Strategic calculation also suggests preparation. Conversations had already taken place. Scenarios had been evaluated. Risks had been weighed against alternatives. One does not pivot at this scale without contingency planning. Statements are drafted in advance, allies are consulted discreetly, exit paths are discussed. All of this happens long before the public becomes aware. The moment itself is simply the execution of a plan already agreed upon. Emotion-driven decisions tend to fracture movements chaotically. This did not. Instead, the shift appeared orderly, almost restrained. That restraint is telling. It indicates a desire to limit collateral damage while signaling seriousness. Those involved were not seeking attention or validation. They were seeking insulation. The goal was not to dominate headlines, but to reposition quietly before circumstances made repositioning impossible. The absence of dramatic language further reinforces the strategic nature of the move. There were no fiery denunciations, no theatrical gestures. Instead, the tone was measured, even subdued. That choice reflects discipline. It suggests that the primary audience was not the public, but other power brokers watching closely for cues. In politics, subtlety often carries more weight than spectacle. This kind of calculation usually emerges when long-term prospects begin to outweigh short-term optics. Individuals stop asking how to win the next argument and start asking how to survive the next year. They begin to think about legacy, viability, and distance. The timing of this action indicates that such questions had already replaced earlier ambitions. It also reflects awareness of inevitability. Strategic actors move not when defeat is obvious, but when it becomes statistically unavoidable. Acting too early carries risk. Acting too late eliminates options. The decision to move at this precise moment suggests that the window for maneuvering was narrowing, and those involved chose to act while they still retained some control over their positioning. Ultimately, the timing reveals clarity rather than panic. It shows that those involved recognized the direction of events and adjusted accordingly. This was not a reaction to breaking news, but an acknowledgement of trends that had been impossible to ignore. The calculation was simple, if unsentimental. Move deliberately now, or be dragged later. This moment cannot be understood in isolation, because it is not the result of a single decision or a single leader's actions. It is the product of a broader institutional trajectory that has been unfolding over years. Internal fractures of this scale emerge only when underlying structures have been stressed repeatedly without resolution. What appears sudden to the public is, in reality, the visible outcome of long-ignored warnings and deferred accountability. Political institutions often absorb pressure by postponing consequences. Controversial choices are justified as temporary necessities. Extreme rhetoric is excused as strategic messaging. Norm-breaking is defended as innovation. Over time, these justifications accumulate, creating an internal environment where standards become flexible and boundaries blur. The cost of this approach is not immediate collapse, but gradual erosion of trust, both within the institution and among the public it seeks to represent. When an internal break finally occurs, it reflects that the institution has reached a point where it can no longer reconcile its public identity with its internal reality. Members begin to recognize that the strategies once used to consolidate power are now undermining it. What was framed as strength begins to resemble instability. At that stage, internal unity becomes less about shared purpose and more about shared risk. This fracture also exposes how institutions respond when confronted with the consequences of their own decisions. Rather than collective accountability, the instinct is often to compartmentalize blame. Distancing becomes a method of preservation. Individuals seek to redefine their roles within the broader structure, emphasizing autonomy over alignment. This is not necessarily driven by malice, but by institutional self-defense. The broader consequence is a loss of coherence. Without a clear internal consensus, messaging fragments. Strategy becomes reactive rather than proactive. Competing priorities emerge, and long-term planning gives way to short-term damage control. These symptoms are not merely signs of disagreement, they are indicators of structural fatigue. Institutions in this phase struggle to project stability because stability no longer exists internally. What makes this moment particularly significant is that it forces a reckoning that can no longer be deferred. Once internal fractures become visible, they demand resolution. Either the institution reforms its approach, reestablishing boundaries and norms, or it continues to fracture under the weight of unresolved contradictions. There is no neutral outcome. Inaction becomes a decision in itself, one that accelerates decline. This reckoning extends beyond internal leadership. It affects voter trust, donor confidence, and institutional credibility. Observers begin to question not just individual decisions, but the reliability of the institution institution as a whole. Rebuilding that trust requires more than rhetorical adjustment. It requires structural change. Without it, fragmentation becomes normalized, and instability becomes the default condition. Ultimately, this internal fracture serves as a mirror. It reflects back the cumulative effects of choices made over time, choices that prioritized immediate advantage over institutional integrity. The consequences now visible are not anomalies. They are the predictable outcome of a system that postponed accountability for too long. This moment strips away the illusion of permanence that often surrounds political power. Influence can appear unshakable when it is backed by momentum, media attention, and institutional alignment. Over time, that visibility creates a sense of inevitability, both among supporters and opponents. But inevitability is not the same as durability. When circumstances shift, power reveals its most fragile characteristic. It depends entirely on continued relevance and utility. Political dominance lasts only as long as it delivers results. Once it begins to produce uncertainty instead of stability, allies reassess their positions. Support that once felt unconditional becomes conditional. Endorsements soften, defenses become cautious, and silence replaces certainty. This transition exposes how quickly influence can diminish when it no longer serves collective interests. What once commanded loyalty now demands explanation, and explanation is often the first sign of decline. This erosion is rarely dramatic at first. Power does not vanish overnight, it thins. Access becomes harder to secure. Assumptions about control begin to fail. Messages that once unified now divide. The machinery still exists, but it no longer moves with the same force. Those operating within it sense the change before the public does, because they experience the resistance internally. Missed calls, delayed decisions, hesitant commitments. The temporary nature of power becomes especially clear when external support systems weaken. Donors, institutions, and influential intermediaries are pragmatic by design. They invest where return and stability align. When instability grows, investment retreats. That retreat accelerates decline, creating a feedback loop where diminishing support reinforces the perception of weakening influence. Power, once seen as self-sustaining, is revealed to be highly dependent on constant reinforcement. Public perception follows a similar pattern. Voters may tolerate controversy, but they rarely tolerate stagnation or chaos indefinitely. When confidence erodes, it does so quietly at first, through disengagement rather than opposition. Enthusiasm fades. Turnout expectations soften. What remains is a hollow structure that looks intact but lacks the energy that once animated it. This moment highlights a fundamental truth. Authority without momentum cannot hold. The appearance of strength is not enough. Influence must continually adapt to shifting realities, or it becomes obsolete. Those who mistake past dominance for future security often fail to recognize when their leverage has already diminished. The realization that power is temporary forces difficult decisions. Individuals who once relied on collective strength begin to prioritize personal viability. Distance replaces defense. Independence becomes a form of insurance. This behavior is not ideological, it is adaptive. It reflects an understanding that clinging to declining influence carries greater risk than acknowledging its limits. In exposing this impermanence, the moment serves as a broader lesson about political systems. Power is borrowed, not owned. It exists only by consent, alignment, and performance. When any of those elements falter, influence contracts. What remains is a clear reminder that dominance is not a guarantee, but a condition, one that can expire far faster than it was built.